So welcome those of you who've joined us. Today we're speaking to Mary Monroe and Gabe Andrade. Gabe, we've spoken to a bunch of times. That's always fun. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll try to let Mary do more of the talking today because I'm sure folks are sick of me.
I'm sure that's not a problem. The topic today was very much in Mary's lane, from what I understand, of Credibly Neutral AI Oracles and the recent research that you, Mary, and Gabe have been doing. So, Mary, if you could just give us a little introduction of yourself, how you kind of got to this position and joined up with Jensen, and then what you have actually been looking into.
Yeah, sounds good. So I am coming into my fifth and hopefully last year of my PhD in computer science at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And so specifically for the past couple of years, I've been doing research in algorithmic economics, which is a theoretical area that sort of combines the ideas that come from game theory, thinking about the incentives of selfish agents, and incorporating that in sort of classic algorithms that we apply, especially in online and, new spaces that have been created by new technologies. So obviously this has a lot of application to the blockchain and AI spaces. Right. And that's sort of what brought me to Jensen. So I've been working with the team, the research team here with Gabe and everyone else throughout the summer as a PhD intern on this problem. Yep.
Fantastic. So what's the main idea of the research that you guys have been doing recently that has ended up with us here on the topic of Credibly Neutral AI Oracle?
Yeah, so we've been specifically thinking about the Oracle problem, which is sort of an all-encompassing term. But the main idea of the Oracle problem, sort of even beyond blockchain, is that we have an automated system of some sort that needs to make a decision or, complete some kind of downstream task that depends on some type of information. So, for example, insurance claims, right? Say like we have a claim about some sort of, airline policy where you get some insurance claim if there's an issue with the flight, like you need the information to come in about what actually happened if the flight was canceled. And this is it's a sort of subtle problem and most clear in blockchain because that information, that information we have to guarantee is high quality and honest. Because when we're in the blockchain, right, we open ourselves up to the outside world through that information. So we don't necessarily want that information to come from a central authority because that just completely sort of destroys the decentralized nature of the blockchain. But if we want it to come from, a decentralized source or mechanism, then that sort of introduces all the classic incentive issues that arise in decentralized settings. So that's sort of the main question we're asking is how do we get this sort of ground truth onto the blockchain using some, mechanism design way to ensure that A, that information is accurate, and B, like it's robust to manipulation by adversarial agents.
Right.
And
most of us being in the blockchain area for a while, we're familiar with oracles of a type, pricing oracle, chain feeds, things like that. How's the work you're doing related to the areas that we're familiar with?
Yeah, so like specifically with DeFi applications, I guess, with pricing oracles, that's just one example. There are, I guess, examples in practice where there is manipulation that happens. For example, people can sort of attempt to manipulate the actual like market feed that is determining what those prices are in order to make money based on whatever the downstream task that the oracle is being used for. So yeah, for DeFi and sort of pricing oracles are just one example. where we still need to be careful about the information being both accurate and manipulation robust. But this really applies, beyond that to prediction market settlements is one thing that we're thinking about very specifically, but other things like insurance claims, like I mentioned before, or even sort of more complex information, like, determining whether a contract has been violated, things like that as well apply to this problem. So there's sort of like a full range of like how complex the actual like information itself is and what determines what this ground truth is. Yeah.
Yeah. To just expand on what Mary said, make it a little explicit, is the classic sort of blockchain DeFi notion of Oracle is really just the tip of the iceberg. And really it's just a much bigger, more sprawling problem. It can go from as simple as that to, you can even envision and it's a bit crazy, but something along the lines of, this is fresh on the mind because of the World Cup, replacing the VAR refs in the World Cup with a multi-rival model that's, it's verifiable, trusted, etc. So that, the Argentina thing that we've been seeing, you can confirm whether it genuinely was a call or if there was someone bribed under the hood. A lot of times we also have settings in the real world where it kind of boils down to, we've investigated ourselves and we've concluded we are innocent. You can envision a world where you use some sort of Oracle technology as a intermediary to evaluate whether or not they truly did investigate themselves, or if they're just claiming that. Right now, we delegate this to neutral third parties, or allegedly neutral third parties, right? You'll hire a law firm or something if you want to investigate yourself. But again, it's always this question of like, oh, you paid them. So yeah, it really does. It's quite sprawling, and I think we're only scratching the surface of how we've come to understand oracles as a technology and what that product could even look like.
Right. That actually brings me towards my next kind of question. The oracles or the services or the law firms that we're using, as you said, Gabe, someone's always got an ability to find a bias just simply because there's payment involved. What do we mean by credibly neutral when we're talking about AI oracles and the work you've been doing?
Right. So the main idea of credible neutrality is that the oracle mechanism itself, or some piece of that oracle mechanism, is independent of the downstream task and the actual mechanism state. So one example is with prediction markets. We have some market, say, over whether or not it's, going to rain tomorrow in Boulder. And the idea is the oracle itself, or at least some layer of that oracle, we often think about it as multiple pieces in one stack, should not depend on the actual market state itself. So it shouldn't depend on the stakes that people have in the market, or the current prices. And an example of a non-credibly neutral oracle would be something like UMA's solution, where anyone can come in actually and determine what the settlement should be. Sorry? Oh, missed that.
What was that, Gabe?
I'll just continue. So yeah.
Gabe might be having a bit of an issue sometimes.
Yeah, so in UMA, anyone can come in and determine the settlement. So I could come in and say, put down some stake and say it rained, even if it didn't. And that's not credibly neutral, because I could plausibly have stake in the market and condition on that stake to, I have stake on it raining, and that's why I decided to come in and settle it, that it rains. And so even though it seems somewhat obvious, there are a lot of oracle systems, because it's a decentralized system, that are actually not credibly neutral. And this is really what leads to the type of manipulation that we've talked about before, where people can have motivation to just completely change the oracle's output because they have something personal to gain from it.
Right. Actually, in the blog that I've linked at the top for everybody, you mentioned several examples that have been either across the last few years or quite strongly in the media recently, and getting out of the industry into the wider media as well. What are your favorites or most extreme examples?
Yeah, there are a couple. A lot of them happen in Polymarket, and because of that sort of UMA system that I just mentioned, I think we like to talk a lot about there's sort of different classes of how this manipulation occurs. But, one example I think that's pretty stark is market in April 2025 on whether Ukraine would agree to some rare earth minerals deal with the Trump administration.
Right.
And in this market, a single participant came in, just like the example I mentioned before, and they held over 25% of the UMA governance tokens, and they forced a premature yes resolution. There is no evidence whatsoever in the world of such a deal. Again, this leads to a dispute vote, and that dispute vote confirmed the initial yes resolution. And so, again, that's probably the most objective example of a whale coming in and manipulating the market. But there are multiple examples. The other favorite one that we like to talk about, which is a different class of manipulation, is a Polymarket market on temperature in Paris. And so in that example, the sensor there's a single sensor at an airport that Polymarket had indicated would resolve the market. And that sensor unexpectedly reported temperatures that were much higher than expected compared to any other sensor in the city. And I actually believe that authorities are actually investigating if someone came in and basically hit that sensor with a hairdryer. So in that case, it's a sort of a different type of manipulation. We're manipulating the actual data source that the Oracle takes in rather than the mechanism if there's a vote involved. But yeah, those two kind of stand out in my mind. I also have examples in my pocket of, non-markets, if that's helpful too, but one can imagine it occurs across different settings.
It is such a wide variety of things that people can do, and that's the point I think you've illustrated. Is a lot of it is human incentives, people incentives that get us into these situations. I want to come back to that in just a second, but just on UMA, I mentioned I was reading recently that there is an entire company that has bought up effectively delegate tokens from smaller holders and has become one of the biggest token holders. How does that fit into the idea of manipulation?
Right. So, that sort of goes back to the fragility of this UMA system. So I think UMA sort of prides itself on being robust because, like I mentioned before, so anyone can come in and to resolve, say, a market or whatever the Oracle output is. And anyone can then actually dispute that, which leads to a majority vote, where that vote is weighted by people's stake in UMA in the system, and anyone can participate in that vote. And I guess UMA sort of, all of their claims lie on sort of require the assumption that at least 50% of that UMA stake is honest, right? At least 50% of the people are going to want to prevent someone from resolving the Oracle to the wrong outcome. But in practice, the evidence you just mentioned, someone trying to just buy out other UMA participants' wallets, is that's just not the case. And the examples that I've mentioned before is, often we've seen in practice that the majority is pretty easily overcome by someone with enough utility for, and manipulating what the oracle's outcome is. And I think there is a recent Wall Street Journal article also talking about how most, a majority of the UMA votes across different polymarket outcomes come from, I think it was like 9 wallets. So there's a big concentration of power there, which sort of completely, I think, sort of removes any idea of decentralization in the first case of this this UMA's sort of claimed solution for the Oracle problem. So yeah,
it's the council within a council.
Yeah.
I think we've set the scene fairly nicely there with all of the issues that oracles currently face. How do we move towards credibly neutral oracles, particularly AI oracles, and how are you getting us there with the work that you guys have been doing?
Yeah, so as we mentioned before, sort of the first step beyond UMA is to really consider how we can implement what I defined as a credibly neutral oracle, right? So the first step is actually creating a solution that doesn't, depend on the stakes that people have over the oracle's outcome. But, that's only one piece of the puzzle because, credible neutrality doesn't really have anything to do with whether the oracle is actually accurate, right? So, our favorite metaphor that we've been using is that a potato is credibly neutral, has no stake in the outcome, but it's not intelligent at all. And so that's where the idea of using LLMs as a piece of the Oracle solution is important. And often an LLM can, we can think about an LLM or AI, which is prompted to answer, whatever the outcome of the Oracle is supposed to be, as approximately credibly neutral. We're able to achieve that because, for one, we can commit to the weights that LLM actually uses to train beforehand, right? So that's one way to think about the model itself, before anything happens in terms of the market or the prices. If it's a price oracle, those are all committed beforehand. And again, there are ways that people can maybe try to attack the LLM to output something that they'd like, but those types of attacks have a much higher bar and require a lot more resources in terms of prompt injections or poisoning attacks. For example, trying to poison the inputs to an LLM, that's much harder than driving to the airport in Paris and heating up a sensor. So LLMs are a great way to approximate this credible neutrality. Not only that, but they're better than a potato in that they're often much more accurate. So that's what we've been thinking about sort of axiomatically. Can we talk about these objects which are both credibly neutral and accurate? And on top of that, like I mentioned before, we can have multiple pieces which we include in a stack. And if we want to be able to correct the LLM's output, because sometimes it is wrong, there's some probability it's wrong, maybe it hallucinates, we can still incorporate decentralized vote on top of that, just like in UMA. And so that's what we propose is we have this LLM as the report layer, but anyone in the system can come in and posit a dispute and say that LLM said it rained, it didn't rain today. And that leads to a threshold vote again. But the key part there is we can actually set that threshold much higher than the majority that I mentioned UMA does. And that's because really there's a much higher probability that we're in a world where the LLM was incorrect, or that we're in a much higher probability because the LLM is accurate that it was correct, in which case someone who's trying to maliciously change its output has to sort of yield enough tokens to overcome, say, like a 75% threshold over 50. And there's only a very small probability that the LLM was wrong, and then someone could sort of uphold that initial output with a smaller number of tokens. So that sort of asymmetry is what allows us to still use that idea of a second escalation layer, but with a much higher threshold for a whale to overcome.
And if it's what we flippantly call an obvious answer, it's obviously a lot more expensive to try and get that to change. Would that be right?
Yes, yeah. So that was sort of my point about sort of the temperature example in Paris versus an LLM. So an LLM tends to take in, right, like millions of data sources online, and versus a much more centralized Oracle system like a single price feed. So it's in terms of someone trying to actually manipulate the input itself to the LLM, that requires a lot more effort and cost on the manipulator's side. And that's just something that's much less feasible than, and for example, even with UMA, there's actually no cost to the first report layer, because you just can come in and say whatever you want, right? So the difference between those two is pretty big. Yeah.
Anybody can just come in and start a dispute for any reason whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly.
In that case.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So the threshold vote that you mentioned in your framework, is that people with tokens, people with something involved, or could it be just a whole bunch of agents and LLMs themselves taking part in that vote?
Yeah. So currently the way that we're thinking about it is there is a final stage where the dispute is just up to token holders. And the reason we often want that is because we want to be able to correct any issues that an automated system like an LLM makes, especially when there's a lot of there's a lot of volume, for example, in the market, or a lot of utility at stake in the downstream task. And in that case, we're talking about a higher threshold for the amount of tokens needed to uphold that vote, specifically to avoid manipulation by human agents. But like you mentioned, we could also consider intermediary stages where instead we incorporate a panel of LLMs, or maybe even a combination of LLMs and human agents. And in that case, it's really a question of sort of a cost trade-off, right? If we have a panel of LLMs, at least at some threshold of how many we have, we'd assume the accuracy only gets better, right? In terms of sort of aggregating all of their different resources. But again, we don't necessarily want to deploy that LLM panel in the first round unless we need to, because someone suspects that the LLM wasn't accurate in the first round because it's costly. But that's another sort of tool that we could use to embed within this Oracle stack, depending on the application and, how worried we are about the accuracy rates and the stuff. Yeah.
Fantastic. So how do we get there? How do we move towards this credibly neutral framework that's obviously got so many advantages over the way things work at the moment?
Right. Yeah. So I think, and at Jensen, we're already moving towards this pretty quickly. And I think other, people are talking about this, but Polymarket is still really sticking to their guns with UMA currently, is sort of, at a minimum, first replacing these incredibly manipulation, these solutions that are so vulnerable to manipulation with more credibly neutral oracles. And, to start, that could just be using and indicating an LLM as the Oracle itself. And I think the important part there is indicating very specifically, what that LLM is doing, how we're deploying it, what question and prompt we're asking it, what weights it has. Any type of opaqueness sort of removes that credible neutrality. So those pieces, in my opinion, are essential to ensuring that people trust the system, right?
Right.
But even, a first step for UMA would just be to replace that first piece and keep that vote mechanism intact. But beyond that, I think people really need to be thinking more carefully about sort of how we decide to have these LLMs interact, like I mentioned in these panels, as well as another layer. But yeah, I think in general, the idea, the way that we've been thinking about it as a framework is that we have a bunch of different tools that we can use, and figuring out, like, I think in practice, which ones work in different settings is like the most important next step. So when do we want that dispute vote? When do we need that sort of more accurate LLM panel, even though it's more costly? And can we create a stack of these different solutions for different, types of complex questions that the Oracle is answering?
We have spoke a little bit about prediction markets predominantly this time. Just be clear, for where else do you see this being of extremely high value across all industries?
Yeah, so like you mentioned before, I think DeFi settings are still especially important here. So, there are examples of price oracle manipulations in the past where people, for example, are able to inflate prices of tokens based on, properties of the market, and use this to value collateral and drain money. So that's one example where, even though maybe the oracles, the outcome itself is pretty objective, we still need to think about this credible neutrality. But beyond DeFi, I think, and beyond sort of those examples that I mentioned before, which maybe we're thinking about more in blockchain, like contracts and insurance claims, etc. I do think the Oracle problem can even sort of be posed outside of blockchain. In any setting where we need to take real world information and return an output that something downstream then uses. So another example that this might apply to is thinking about LLM as a judge settings. But yeah, so I really think that the Oracle problem, the theoretical model, this idea of having, some type of ground truth and having to translate that into an output that a mechanism then acts on, is super broad in general. And like something that we're thinking about that I think is much more difficult to grasp, but especially important too, is when that, what the Oracle is actually supposed to output is maybe not objective. So it could be something that's more subjective, like an opinion aggregation, or something that is not so clear as like a price, or even something like temperature. In that case, we have to be even more careful about how we model that Oracle, and we're thinking about that as well. But it's not super clear to me yet what the solution is, but I think we need a solution for that type of problem.
Right. I was being a little unserious in my head when I was thinking, as you said, LLM as a judge. I was already thinking of credibly neutral AI judicial officers and business disputes, things like that. Now that would obviously be a very, very long way down the track. That sounds like what you're referring to with things that aren't so black and white, so numerical.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the escalation is an important facet of that as well, right? Like right now we think of it very LM judges as like they're the law, like the judge, jury, and the executioner in some sense. With good oracle design, you might get something that in these subjective cases or in these really complex, nuanced cases, if pretty much everyone's in agreement, like why litigate the thing to the end of the era? But then if there is something suspicious and we can define the appropriate escalation mechanism, etc., there is a ripcord to override it and move back to a more traditional system, that sort of thing.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. Welcome back, Gabe. Had a bit of trouble there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's not like me this space, which is good because Mary's been doing an amazing job. So
doing a marvelous job. Were there any other points, Gabe, that you were thinking about while you were offline there that you wanted to add?
No, Mary pretty much covered all the same. We're really aligned on the thinking about this. The only thing I'd expand on is like these. You asked about use cases beyond just like price oracles and prediction markets and so on. And Mary gave you the very like principal non-sci-fi answer. There's a bit of a sci-fi answer to it as well, which is like you can really imagine like this extension of like the computer in the sky analogy for blockchains, right? Where you have these sorts of oracles.
As the conversations between you and I generally end in Skynet.
Yeah, it's almost always where this leads. You can have a dystopia or utopia. So let's leave it there. Anyway, but no, I would say you can really extend this computer in the sky analogy that people have had for blockchains, or that Tim Roughgarden famously speaks of. And having this really ramps up how powerful that analogy becomes. Before you had to kind of navigate this really adversarial kind of stiff state machine. It was really hard to use, and the use cases where it makes sense to do that versus a more traditional centralized sort of approach were a bit fuzzy. But you can envision with an oracle in the middle and kind of moving the state machine along in a less rigid way. When you look into kind of use cases that blockchains and so on might be applied to. In fact, I think part of the exercise we're going to have to go on in the next few months to years is going to be really breaking down assumptions we have about we sort of think, like I threw the Argentina example earlier. Like, it sounds ridiculous, but then you stop and think about it for a second. You're like, I mean, there is a world where conceivably that does make sense to do. I think we're gonna have to spend some time really going through that thought experiment, breaking down assumptions of cases where we don't traditionally think of it as an oracle problem, but really it is. We just haven't had a reasonable way of tackling it until now.
Absolutely. I think if you do let the mind wander a little bit, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. In fact, I was going down a couple of sidetracks and lost what I was going to ask next. Where do you guys think we are going next in the short term in this kind of field?
Do you mean like on the Jensen team specifically, or just in general, sort of like the Oracle solutions that are coming out short term?
I mean, we've probably covered both, because even the external ones will affect what we're doing internally as well, I think.
Yeah, my view would be that it's probably like short to even like short to medium term, I guess. I don't know how we'd want to find that, but I do expect us to start seeing some more Oracle products appear. And I mean general purpose Oracle products, right? Right now, Uma is an incumbent, and it kind of is the only player in the space. But I imagine we're going to start seeing a few different versions of Uma appear, where Uma doesn't need to be just for prediction marks. It can be for pretty much anything. You could litigate a lot of things with Uma if you give people context about what they're litigating. But I imagine we see a general purpose Oracle product where, for example, you want to enforce contracts or handshakes between any two or any number of parties that each are adversarial or strategic in some way. And prediction marks is a very natural place to start with. But yeah, I do think that we'll see a product like that very soon.
Yeah, agreed with Gabe. And I think as technologies continue to sort of evolve in the blockchain, specifically and beyond prediction markets, and as those technologies get more popular, like we'll start to see, like he said, people thinking more carefully about the actual mechanism design of these oracles and creating products that are able to sort of generalize across these different settings.
Yeah. To be concrete, actually, you're saying that our audience is probably very familiar with. I mean, I'm going to age myself as a dinosaur in terms of blockchain stuff. But I remember early on people having these debates about like, well, what's the point of Bitcoin, for example? If I go to buy a car with Bitcoin and then turns out that the block that had the transaction didn't go through or whatever, I just got a car for free. So no car salesman would ever use Bitcoin, right? I remember there being an argument. Well, conceivably now you could spin up, there might be an Oracle product that allows people to make these sorts of short-term agreements so that then like actually makes the transfer only once that block gets published, for example. Yeah, you can imagine that this generalizing in general. This generalizing, sorry, broadly, where you now are able to have these transactions that previously were a bit risky, honestly, because there's no enforcer in the middle.
Right. Effectively making sure that things that different parties have agreed to actually do take place.
Yeah, exactly. You actually see this currently in like people selling and buying real estate, right? There is usually an escrow agency in the middle, but that's for a massive purchase. There's just a lot of other facets of life where probably it'd be nice to get an escrow agency, but I don't just carry one in my back pocket with me. And it seems a bit ridiculous to set this up between me and someone else for $100 purchase, let's say. But now it becomes possible, really. I mean, you can imagine something as silly, I guess, as like a Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace now getting much more like legitimized in some sense. I guess less sketchy to some degree.
I mean, it was a simple example, yeah, but it's a great use. So I have personally been the middleman escrow for some very, very expensive NFT transactions, and it's not something I wanted to do again. It was absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
Mary, what are you most excited about after having been in this particular world for a little while?
So I think kind of going off of what I said previously, like I'm really excited to see where like the use cases that we haven't discovered yet for the Oracle problem, because we know they're out there. And being able to use these solutions, like you said, even in a simple example where you were the middleman of this NFT transaction, like being able to use this pretty cheap sort of theoretical solution that's robust, and be able to sort of plug that in to make things a lot easier for everyone, and to also just improve like overall trust in decentralized systems, because that's kind of, that's maybe one of the main downstream goals, right, of creating these robust oracles in the first place.
Fantastic. Whenever anybody's getting a benefit, and you can always do with more trust in these systems. Thank you very much, guys. That was fantastic. I can't wait to see what's coming down the line as you continue the research. I believe what you've put out so far is only effectively part one. There's going to be almost a series on this kind of work. Is that right?
Yeah. The plan, like I said, sort of the language I was using before is that we're really thinking about it like a stack or a toolbox, and we've sort of presented some pieces of that, but we're really trying to think hard about sort of making it a full toolbox that we don't have yet, and also thinking more big picture about how these pieces apply in different settings. So yeah, definitely more to come.
Amazing. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, in general, it was just something that was a bit jarring for us almost. Then the Oracle problem has been studied pretty extensively in more like blockchain sort of security, from a security sort of angle. But with this game theory, mechanism design angle, that is so natural for talking about it, honestly. So yeah, we'll be chugging along in that direction for the foreseeable future. So expect more.
Brilliant. I can't wait. We'll have you both back up here very, very soon. I think that was fantastic, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody that came along to listen in. And yeah, we'll be back here shortly with another one. And can't wait to see the next installment, Mary.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Xavier.